See how it's recording, and then...
Hello everyone. This is a beginning for our makeup sessions for Philosophy 402 in order to complete the materials that I was not able to present to you myself, and which Dr. Retnitzer was likewise unable to present because of the problems that developed technologically between Jerusalem and Cincinnati. I want to simply remind you we are picking up from our discussion of Eugene Borowitz and his book Renewing the Covenant, which we began before the Passover vacation. And I will pick up at the point where I believe I left off at that time, and we will go from there. There will be the equivalent of 2 sessions, roughly of 1 hour and 15 minutes each, in which we will cover the remaining subject matter of the book. Where we left off in our initial session on Borowitz had to do with his background. You'll recall we talked about his aims and general method in the book, although there's more to be said on that. And we got to the point of a set of distinctions regarding modernity and postmodernity that are rather important for the understanding of the position that he holds. I think I probably referred you back to Huston Smith and his article with which we began this semester, and there was a periodization, 3 periods specifically focused on late antiquity through the Middle Ages, then modernity, and then postmodernity. But I also want to call your attention to some major points that Borowitz himself makes about the distinction. First, why is it important to pay attention to the distinction between modernity and postmodernity? Because he sees himself as a postmodern Jew, and therefore much that he says is meant to be either an adaptation of things he thinks was worthwhile, things he thinks were worthwhile, and genuine contributions to Jewish theology in the modern period, but he also takes issue with a great deal of what characterized modernity, and that is why he regards himself as a postmodern Jew. So once we begin to see what characterizes postmodernity for him, as opposed to Huston Smith, we will have a better sense of where he is coming from, where he sees himself situated in time, and likewise will be in a position to perhaps both describe more accurately and also appraise more accurately what he is arguing for as we go along. That said, let me at least itemize the main characteristics he associates with modernity. I'll make some references from time to time to page numbers and page references where you can see what is the source in his book. But from time to time, likewise, as we have done in class, I will likewise be going through individual passages of the book, which I think are important enough to read and to analyze. This time, obviously, I won't be calling for volunteers because you are not here present in the room, but I will serve as a volunteer reading for you. I hope I'll at least comment in a knowledgeable way on the things that might be of interest to you, and if not, you can comment to me and ask whatever questions come to your mind before the semester is over. So first of all, regarding modernity and what also could be called the ideology of modernity, known as modernism, the basic things that he calls our attention to is, first of all, the existence of a movement which took place over several decades and had influence long afterwards, called the Enlightenment. He specifically calls attention in Europe to the French Enlightenment, although there was also a German or Central European Enlightenment as well. Kant represents that in certain ways. And there's likewise the American Enlightenment, which is to say it is the influence of rational ideas and self-evident truths that had a great deal to do with the ideology of the founders, those who framed the Declaration of Independence, not only Thomas Jefferson, but its signers who agreed with its ideas, and likewise the Constitution, and many of the ideas into the middle of the 19th century and beyond that have come to be taken as rational truths and moral beliefs that are thoroughly evident and should be thoroughly evident to everyone. What are some of the characteristics, in addition to this centrality of enlightenment, that he names? Well, the Enlightenment is characterized by universal categories. That is to say, universal ideas and categories of thinking are invoked regularly, again and again. So whatever is being said is not for a particular group or for unique individuals alone. It is applicable to every person. Now, there are exceptions, obviously. You may all remember the 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution with regard to slaves. Women did not have the right to vote, so all of these are legitimate points that should be made. But at least the ideology made the effort to call attention to what was universal and emphasize its importance. Precisely because of that, the challenges that have been made to the limitations of actual implementation of enlightened ideas has been all the more effective, because these cases regarding slaves and the emancipation of blacks, for that matter I might add the emancipation of Jews, and suffrage, that is to say the vote for women, and other things long afterwards, have been made possible because the limits that were placed on all of these groups were seen as inconsistent with the universal principles that were being proclaimed. The principles being most evidently, especially in accordance with the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, that is to say mutual care for citizens within a society. So, universal categories tend to be emphasized within the Enlightenment framework. It is also characteristic of modernity that rationalism is triumphant. That is to say, human beings of whatever backgrounds should be able to agree on rational principles if they are trying to use their minds and their logic more than their personal loyalties, family backgrounds, group loyalties, and the like. And the appeal was always to rational individuals. Fourth on my list, there was a growing willingness to encourage assimilation of different groups into this larger ethos of rational people who would be citizens of the various nations of Europe and of the United States. Canada also is included, and theoretically other nations in the Latin part of America, South America, and even Central America. And so Jews, to focus on the most familiar element, were expected upon being given emancipation to acculturate themselves to, and at least in important political ways and some important social ways, to socialize themselves into the surrounding culture, so that the basic categories that were shared by enlightened people could be shared by them as well with enlightened people. Universal equality was very characteristic of the ideology of modernity, and it still obviously has great influence on our thinking today. Ethics, a single body of norms, or one single rule that could be generalized and seen to be applicable to everybody, was also characteristic of modernity. That's why you have the categorical imperative formulated by Kant, even though he had multiple formulations of it, being invoked as the basis for ethical treatment. It would have been the modern rational equivalent to the Golden Rule. Excuse me. And finally, you could say that modernity is characterized by universal meta-narratives. What do I mean by a meta-narrative? It is essentially a framework that applies to humanity at large, in which certain projects that are taken upon, or which are undertaken by individuals or even by groups, begin to make sense insofar as they are part of humanity at large. Just to give an example or two, someone who is admitted to a university system who would otherwise not have even been considered as eligible by virtue of their religion or their cultural background or ethnic background, insofar as that person was admitted and could meet the standards, then he or she would be acceptable, and the work that he or she would do would be a contribution either to the field being studied, whatever it was, medicine, history, you name it. But the idea was a contribution to human knowledge, something deemed valuable in itself. And the more contributions to it could be made, so much the better. That would be one example. Other examples, well, I'll select only one other one right now, that when someone would receive rights that were otherwise not available to them, either because of their religion, ethnic background, or what have you, that would be a step towards the liberation of humanity. That constraints and disabilities that had been placed in people's way, that had limited their capacity to improve themselves or advance themselves, these things would be removed and thereby contribute to the liberation in principle of all human beings. So here again you have a key idea that is operative in much that is associated with modernity. What about postmodernity? It has an ideology also. It is called postmodernism. And in this view, first of all, there is a primacy that is accorded in importance and value to both individuals and groups that is not characteristic of modernity. Particularistic as opposed to universalistic categories are increasingly invoked and deemed to be valuable, so that one's unique background as a member of this group or this religious tradition has greater value placed on it than used to be the case within a purely modern context, and it receives more attention and presumably more appreciation. It could also merit more criticism in one way or another, depending on relationships cultivated or not cultivated with other groups, whether there are conflicts and what characterizes those conflicts. A second characteristic is a qualified rejection of enlightenment, that it is not altogether positive because it ignores or actually discourages valuing important aspects of individuals, groups, and particular traditions, particularism as such. A third characteristic is that it rejects rationalism. Not that it encourages irrationality deliberately, it does not, but it places value on other aspects of the human personality beside reason. One of them would be feeling and emotion. It's actually very characteristic of our time for people to say, and you may even notice this in your own speech, I feel something very deeply, or I feel sure that such and such is so, with or without evidence. So that would be one example. Having a unique language in which one speaks, as opposed to a universal language. For example, I have the unique background of perhaps coming from a Latin American community, and if I speak Spanish or Portuguese, that is something to be valued. And if I can't speak English, well, I can learn English, and that is to be encouraged, but by all means, what I have preserved from my past heritage should continue to be preserved so that my unique differences can continue to be valued and contributions made in terms of what makes me unique as opposed to what makes me a part of humankind. Technology and science are not deemed universal panaceas, as would more normally have been the case within modernity, which valued modern science and the technology that went with it almost uncritically for a rather long time. There is still equal favoring of the value of equality in postmodernity. This is one modern value that is passed on to the postmodern era and basically treated without either rejection or a critical emendation about how it has to be altered, reinterpreted, or somehow improved. In addition to this, we have, let us call we have a phenomenon called contextualism. By that, we're talking about understanding someone or a work of thought, theology, but not only theology, art, poetry, literature, in terms of the cultural context of a particular thinker or writer. And that context is always treated as something of value, even though there will be a whole variety of such contexts and people who represent them. Ethics are not treated in terms of abstract principles as much in postmodernity as let me restate that. Ethics are not treated in postmodernity in universalistic terms in quite the same way that they are within modernity, so that we'll have abstract rules that will apply equally in the same respect to absolutely everyone, irrespective of their backgrounds and other characteristics which are individual or distinctive of a group. Instead, you will have an ethics of both self-respect and respect for others in their uniqueness. So everybody's valuable even if they're different from you, but it's not because of an abstract principle. It's just that our differences are as valuable as what makes us the same. That is what tends to get emphasized within the postmodern context. And finally, there is generally a new realism, and perhaps even in some respects limitation on what human beings are deemed capable of accomplishing. We don't believe within postmodernity, especially according to Borowitz, in inevitable human progress, and that things will get better with time just because human beings advance and learn more and are more self-conscious about doing wrong and harm to each other. If anything, World War I, World War II, the Holocaust in particular, and many other conflicts since have indicated to us that no matter how knowledgeable we become and how culturally sophisticated, that is not a guarantee that beastly things may take place and be perpetrated by people who have this cultured background. In this sense, this new realism about human limitations characterizing postmodernity is a response to the meta-narrative expressing confidence in human capabilities, almost utter confidence in human capabilities that characterizes modernity. All right, so much for the background. If we turn to Borowitz, we have one other item that needs to be taken into account, and this is a more concrete specification of the way he sees history unfolding. So while parts of what I'll summarize to you in just a moment will be perfectly obvious and uncontroversial, you will see that there are specific frames of time reference that help him to understand the unfolding of history and the two periods that are of interest to us. And I want to mention them to you so that they will be part of the background of what we covered. He gives the following periodization of Jewish history. And notice it's Jewish history, not human history. Period 1 is the period of entering the covenant. It extends from Abraham to Sinai, that is to say the revelation in the wilderness and the period of wandering in the wilderness. He does not give an exact set of years, but presumably the wandering in the wilderness ends in the vicinity of 1250 BCE. The second period is the period of settlement and exile. That is to say, the Jewish people, otherwise at the time known as the people Israel, settled in the land of Canaan, roughly around 1250 BCE, and remained there with, of course, the major interruption of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586-87 BCE, and the exile in Babylonia, which was at least partly reduced and diminished after the conquest of Babylonia by the Persians and the Medes, by Cyrus of Persia in particular, roughly in 539, and which led to at least a portion of the exilic community returning back to the land of what was Canaan, and will probably after that be understood or designated as Palestine, to resettle it and eventually to rebuild the temple, the second temple in this case. This period ends in 70 CE with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. The third period is the period of rabbinism. It extends from 500 of the Common Era, which is to say that's the, no, wait a second. It extends, I'm sorry, my eyes drifted. It extends from 70 of the Common Era, and you can also substitute the date 135 of the Common Era, which is the period or the point at which the Bar Kokhba rebellion is put down. Not only is Jerusalem off limits to Jews at that time, but much of Judea ceases to be their home. And the period of rabbinism extends from either 70 or 135, depending on your point of reference, to approximately 500 of the Common Era. Thereafter, we have what he calls the diaspora, the focus on the majority of Jews living not in their original homeland, but elsewhere in the Mediterranean region, North Africa, the Middle East, that is to say the countries that would have constituted essentially Iraq and Iran, and even in certain parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Eventually, beyond that, to the north, there were the Khazars, who had an independent kingdom for a short time, roughly from 740 to, if I remember correctly, about 1030 of the Common Era, and ending in 1789. Ending why? 1789, you'll all recall, is the year of the French Revolution. And while the diaspora communities continue to exist, something fundamental changes, and that is the status of Jews, basically as an isolated minority in many communities, and sometimes also a persecuted minority, being given the opportunity, in principle, to become citizens of the countries in which they dwell. This does not happen simultaneously, obviously, in 1789 for all of them. Then it only creates the framework within which emancipation will be offered to Jews at various points in Europe and beyond. So 1789 becomes the point of reference, and it is characterized by a kind of secular messianism. That is to say, what begins in 1789 to create an ethos of equality, liberty, and fraternity is looked upon as the way out and the solution to the problems that had beset Jews, and even in certain ways the Jewish religion during the Middle Ages. And in Jews becoming modern and accepted and having the rights of citizens in their various countries, real problems could be solved, and a normal life and much creativity could be introduced into the life of Jews and the Jewish religion. When does this period end? For Borowitz, it ends in 1933. Obviously, the year in which Hitler and the Nazi Party is accorded power in Germany, and not too long afterwards in Austria as well. The ideology of Nazi racism, which was very well known even before the 1933 election, nonetheless now established, produced the program of extermination that culminated in the Shoah. And that is, in fact, the point of reference that leads us to postmodernity. When our illusions about human capability, at least as Borowitz puts it, are fundamentally undermined by what takes place during the Shoah, but not only the Shoah. And we have what is called by him the postmodern turn. It is associated with the years 1933 through 45, up through the present, which is to say it would extend through the mid-1990s when the volume we're reading was published. So the key events that have to be taken into account for him are the Holocaust and the rebirth of the State of Israel. In that sense, he is similar to Fackenheim, who also accords to those two events a very real importance. That said, I want to go on and point out the following features that he emphasizes. Borowitz often gives a false impression of where Jews are at. One could argue that Western culture failed not because it was a fraud, which is what he suggests is the reason for the developments in the period of 1933 through 44. That is to say, that its ideals, its ethical ideals in particular, proved to be a fraud. Not simply because of what Germany did and Austrians did, but because there were so many, who joined them in Europe, across enlightened countries, even in France, and well beyond, going to the east, but also because of what you know likewise about the non-receptiveness of enlightened people in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world to the plight of Jews and others who were being persecuted by the Nazis. The Western ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were curiously silent or absent. I've already made a reference in our recent class on Fackenheim to the St. Louis. Fackenheim makes reference to it in the thought experiment we talked about recently. That kind of matter is what prompts Borowitz to speak about the fraud of Western ideals, or fraudulence of Western ideals. One could say, however, that the ideals were not fraudulent, but that there was a failure to live up to those ideals. That could indeed be another way of responding to what he is saying. Borowitz is making the more radical claim, and that is why postmodernity is going to be suspicious about even the modern ideals and how realistic they are in terms of being realized in the world as we know it after the years 1933 through 45. In a sense, those who regard the Western ideals as fraudulent insofar as they're associated with modernity, those holding that position would likewise be inclined to reject Western culture. In this regard, Borowitz is a little more open to the charge of readiness to reject Western culture than many others. You've also seen evidence of this, let the truth be told, in others we have studied. You'll recall the indictment that Stephen Schwarzschild makes against Western values at the beginning of the article on the theology of Jewish survival. So that should figure into it. And Fackenheim is likewise critical in various writings of his. So Borowitz is not unique in this, but he is strong in his feelings here. Another thing about Borowitz is that he tends to focus very primarily on Ashkenazic Jewish history as being at the center of things. In that sense, there is a certain parochialism in the point of view that is taken. And the other item that is most central and needs to be taken into account right from the beginning is that because his methodology, as he has declared it himself, is designed to move from the inside out and not from the outside in. That is to give a justification for Jewish belief and practice, building on his own personal experience. You can see that his own point of view really is at the center of things. And as he articulates various issues and problems in the course of the entire book, what he does is outline other points of view differing from his own, only with the view to give his own reactions to them and to give his reasons for having those reactions. So you will see a lot of back and forth in what takes place between Borowitz and his own views and the views of various other theologians or movements within Judaism, modern and postmodern Judaism. Okay, so with that said, let us continue by noting this, that modernity is, for Borowitz, the betrayer. The pages you will want to look at are pages 17 through 20, and we will want to look at page 29 as well, where he speaks of modernity's pridefulness. A good example of someone who represents a modernist point of view, whom he criticizes, is Mordechai M. Kaplan, the famous founder of the Reconstructionist movement. He is the one who speaks of God as a power, not ourselves, which makes for salvation in human history. And even though Kaplan distinguishes God from ourselves, the power, not ourselves, nonetheless, the naturalistic orientation of Kaplan and his identification of Judaism as an evolving religious civilization with all of the initiatives beginning from human beings, doing the cultural things that they do that generate creativity and novelty and preserving folk ways and the like. All of this he considers a portion of, or an expression of, Borowitz considers an expression of discredited humanism. Our disillusionment is a disillusionment for some, and he thinks it is disillusionment that we should have with human capacities to evolve so positively over time. Others might regard it as a failure of nerve. Let's look at a text on page 21 at the bottom of the page, where we can see a little bit of how he views this. Liberal religion, this is the last paragraph on page 21. Liberal religion, which preached accommodation to the culture as its new messianism, must share in this indictment of our culture. It once seemed so obvious that autonomous moderns would make a place for religion in their lives if we modernized our old rites here are R-I-T-E-S, and made self-commanding what God's will once imposed upon us. In other words, if we impose it upon ourselves by self-legislating it, and I'm appropriating a Kantian expression, then that would make it legitimate. As long as liberalism emancipated us from the tyranny of old orthodoxies its innovativeness elicited enthusiasm. But as a once repressive culture advanced to permissivism, freedom became more our problem than our redemption. Why not became a terrifying opening to self-destruction and social rot. The apostles of change and adaptation found themselves with nothing independent to say about the limits that would keep us from joining society's onward rush to amorality. So in a sense, you're seeing here Horowitz's critique of modernity and modernism being expressed very, very concisely in this paragraph. He goes on to say, rationalism and science, the two great mentors that we thought would be the basis of our ennoblement, lost their mythic authority. We discovered that they reinforced relativism more than they specified enduring values. And by substituting personal growth and self-fulfillment for God's revelation, liberal religion now looked to be only another social agency eating away at our faith in high standards for human responsibility. Okay? So there's an expression of it, of the critique of modernity, and the basis, at least, for a welcoming of postmodernity. What about orthodoxy? Would orthodoxy be a movement, or at least a frame of mind that we could return to? If you turn to pages 26 and 27, we'll see how he responds to this, because in some ways, the return to orthodoxy, or as we would probably put it here, the return to tradition, becomes a much more plausible and appealing possibility. And in some respects, the return to tradition has been going on here in Cincinnati and elsewhere at the college and in Reformed Judaism generally for quite some time, since the end of World War II. So I'm reading in the middle right now of page 26. But it turns out that character is not educable, or as educable, as modernists hope, society not as malleable, and culture not as humanizing as messianic modernism, secular and religious, once taught. Now it seems plain to many that religion best serves human beings in creatively disengaging from the society, as well as adapting them to its latest passions. In other words, assimilating to the surrounding culture is less valuable than in disengaging from the influence and trends of the surrounding culture. He goes on. More the newly orthodox than anyone anticipated have opted for disciplines that unambiguously proclaim their disdain for modernity by demanding a pre-modern lifestyle. In other words, the Orthodox are insisting on a pre-modern lifestyle, not a modern one. The question is, what's the relation of the pre-modern now to postmodern? The efflorescence of such sects provides important testimony about the spiritual motives prompting our postmodern religiosity. And here's what he goes on to say that's really quite unusual. Overwhelmingly, however, the move to religious orthodoxies has not taken an obscurantist form. Rather, it has been accompanied by a judicious, religiously selective acceptance of some of modernity's benefits. For example, civility and disagreement, and some tolerance of dissent, openness to uncommon cultural styles, recognition of the role of the body, sexuality, and emotion in our lives, science and scholarship as allies rather than enemies, and the importance of works of social ethical activism. All of these are characteristic of American evangelicals and fundamentalists, who are orthodox in their religious views, as you might well understand. But knowing that traditional religion has much to teach our morally feeble culture, they propose to stand up to it and correct its excesses instead of genuflecting to it. Only a religion that possesses a truth independent of the culture secure because of its long history and depth of tradition, confident that it will long survive the present social malaise and ultimately be vindicated. Hence, only an orthodoxy can hope to carry out this prophetic role. Now, this is not simply a straw man. He is, if not identifying literally with orthodoxy, which he does not quite do, as you will see, nonetheless, he is identifying with the orthodox, or shall we say, more traditionalist critique of what modernity has wrought. So here are some textual evidence that bears out the distinctions I was making earlier on. In the next 20 minutes, I'll try to show you where this is taken. What is God's relationship to history in view of the disappointments that he speaks about and in view of the values that he thinks worthy of preserving that he speaks about as well? He actually argues for the point of view that God does participate in history, has actually saved Israel in its history, and is rather sympathetic to the notion of God's role in this historical context, even when many who associate themselves with postmodernity are more disposed to raise the question, where was God when we needed him? Turn, if you will, to page 44 of your text. This has to do with the Six-Day War, in which God's presence in history seems to be much less ambiguous than it used to be. Here's what he has to say, starting from the first full paragraph on that page. The circumstances of the Six-Day War and its consequences radically raised our Jewish consciousness toward the state of Israel. The prior public discussion of the Holocaust had made us apprehensive that God would be again absent, and television pictures of demonstrators in various Arab capitals calling for the destruction of the state of Israel made the threat personal. The great Christian churches were silent. The leaders of the democracies, non-committal. He's talking about May 1967. The three-day news blackout after the war began was a time of hideous imagination, of deep soul-searching, of religious hope and consternation, and produced an overwhelming voluntary outpouring of help. There was real fear that there would be another Holocaust in 1967. The voluntary outpouring of help, most notably from Jews, occurred at this time. Even Jews who had never previously included themselves in the community. Then news came of the staggering Israeli victory. World Jewry experienced an elation that transcended relief from dread or rejoicing at Israeli prowess. The Bible calls it deliverance, and his reference to that is quite deliberate. Jews everywhere found themselves uncomprehendingly overwhelmed by the sight of the soldiers converging on the Temple Mount's western wall. Atheists, agnostics, and believers alike found themselves